In the autumn of 1907, an Austrian lawyer named Ernst Lanza suffers a mental break after repeated nightmares where he's forced to undergo a horrific form of torture involving rats. He first heard about this gruesome fate sometime in 1906 while a young military officer. It was during this stint in the army that he overheard his comrades talking about some of the worst things that had happened to prisoners of war. One particular item that stuck in Lanza's mind was the story of a man who had a bucket of rats attached to his buttocks, and then a fire was lit over that bucket, forcing the rats to burrow into the man's backside to escape the heat, all the while tearing him apart from the inside. Although it was harmless barrack chat to his comrades, the details of the process stuck with him. It instantly became an obsessive fear. Lanza just could not get the image out of his head. The thought of rats frantically burrowing into soft flesh, ripping and tearing through sensitive areas, and shredding organs. He became convinced that one day this would happen to him, or to his lover, or maybe even his family. Before long, these waking thoughts entered his sleeping dreams, and within a year he was left unable to function, tormented night and day by the images of rats gnawing through everything they could find. Left with no option but to get help, Lanza realizes he might have to reach out to a professional. The problem was that most therapy at the time involved shock treatment, hypnosis, perhaps even a stint in a sanatorium. Hardly an appealing thought for a man already tormented by dreams of torture and powerlessness. Fortunately for Lanza, though, there's an up-and-coming hotshot, a Dr. Sigmund Freud, who cures his patients with a revolutionary new approach named psychoanalysis, and instead of using invasive procedures, he uses a much gentler talking method to cure his patients. In October 1907, the two men met, and Freud was immediately struck by the level of torment that Lanza was going through. Freud would later go on to call Lanza the Rat Man, and to use the psychologist's own words, he had the idea that rats would gnaw through his anus or intestines, and this would be his punishment for his perceived transgressions. And to be fair to Lanza, he's not totally wrong to be haunted by the image. Violence of this kind was an occupational hazard for a military man, and good records would have existed that detailed how this torture was used on the victims. Lanza, of course, would have been drawn to these gruesome details like a moth to a flame. First, the victim is strapped into a chair or onto a table, and then a cage filled with hungry rats is attached to his abdomen. And then comes the heat. Either through hot coals or fire, the far end of the cage is made punishingly hot. The rats panic, and with no other way to escape, they burrow through the skin of the belly and into the victim. Once inside, through either instinct or frenzy, they tear through intestines, grind through bone, and shred fat and flesh into pulp. The entire time, by the way, the victim is awake for this, being eaten alive from the inside out, often surviving for several hours or days after the torture is concluded and the rats have been taken away. Terrifying as all this is, though, Lanza is in good hands, at least by the standards of the early 20th century. See, Freud had a shiny new idea about where nightmares came from. He believed that Lanza's horrific visions were a reflection of his unconscious thoughts, and that they had a psychological basis inside Lanza's mind that came from feelings of shame, guilt, or insecurity, and that these unconscious conflicts needed to be resolved in order to free Lanza of his torment. The idea, by the way, that dreams were meaningful phenomena produced by an unconscious mind was revolutionary, especially when we compare it to our previous thought about where nightmares came from. To properly understand how progressive Freud's ideas were, we need to go back through history, all the way to one of the first nightmares ever recorded, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Sometime in 603, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, wakes from a terrifying dream. At the time, Babylon was one of the most powerful cities in the known world, and it was at the height of its power. But the king is haunted by a nightmare in which a colossal statue, with a head of gold, chest of silver, torso of bronze, and legs of iron, is suddenly smashed to pieces right in front of him. The object that demolishes his statue is described as a stone, not made by human hands. After consulting with his priests and advisors, the dream is interpreted as an omen, a warning from the gods that all empires eventually fall, including the Babylonians. Within a century, Babylonia would be a shadow of its former self, practically swallowed by the Persian Empire. The omen had come true. Elsewhere in the classical world, nightmares are similarly interpreted, not as a product of the mind, but as visitations by divine beings who've come to reveal future dangers and fortunes. In a word, omens. And they were serious business. In ancient Egypt, there were people employed in the pharaoh's courts whose only job was to interpret dreams in order to help the rulers prepare for future dangers. These interpreters would even have something called a book of dreams that they could consult in order to translate the pharaoh's nightmares into real-world events. Visions of serpents were a sign of danger or impending treachery. Losing teeth was a sign of loss, decay, or decline. The Cairo Papyrus recounts a vivid dream of Amenemhat I, where he sees a lion threatening him in his sleep, and this is taken as an omen that soon there'll be danger from a rival. Bad dreams were also treated as omens in Roman society, the most famous of these coming from Calpurnia, the wife of Julius Caesar, who wakes up the night before his assassination screaming from a nightmare. In her dream, she's haunted by visions of Caesar's demise and begs him not to go to the Senate the following day. Caesar brushes the omens aside and pays for it. In all reality, Calpurnia's nightmares probably didn't happen, even though all the classical sources do mention it. Plutarch and Cassius Dio say that she dreamed a large statue of Caesar spurting blood onto the ground, and Suetonius and Appian simply write that her dream was of him being murdered. It's worth remembering, though, that all of these sources were written over a century after the actual event, and some historians argue that Calpurnia's nightmare was added to the story later for dramatic effect. But the fact that the nightmare makes the story more compelling tells us that the typical attitude towards a nightmare was that it was an omen, and in Caesar's case, an omen that was ignored with grave consequences. By the time we get to the medieval period, explanations for the origins of nightmares would change, seeing them not as omens to reveal future events, but instead as demonic beings sent to punish sinners. This, by the way, is where we get our modern day word for bad dreams from. A mare, or a horse, that would sit on your chest, preventing you from moving or calling for help. This mare, of course, came in the night when you were sleeping, so it was a nightmare. This, of course, is not just a description of bad dreams, but of a phenomenon known as sleep paralysis, which is a temporary inability to speak or move directly after falling asleep or waking up. And if you haven't experienced one of these before, consider yourself lucky. Oftentimes, this sleep paralysis was thought to be accompanied with the appearance of an evil spirit, if male an incubus, if female a succubus, which were thought to sexually violate you in the night and cause this inability to scream or move. For instance, in the Golden Legend, Sir Dunstan has a nightmare which is recorded as follows. In the depth of night, as I slumbered, a hideous figure approached me, its form a dark and shifting mass. I felt a crushing weight upon my breast, as if all the sins of the world lay upon me, and my soul was nearly crushed by the terror of its presence. Still, like classical thought, medieval belief was that nightmares were the result of external forces and were not the product of the brain or the mind. This would all change, however, during the Enlightenment period of the 17th and 18th century, where we had our first attempts to recognise the phenomenon of nightmares as something that could be explained by the mechanisms of the mind, and not by some kind of moral consideration. They were still wholly unsatisfying, often blaming the origin of nightmares on things like your eating habits, hence that old wives' tale of cheese before bed causing nightmares, and as for the nightmares themselves, they were considered to be essentially meaningless. The English philosopher John Locke describes dreams as not derived from any external substances or forces, but from the individual's own internal experiences. The visions of the night, those strange and fantastic figures which haunt our sleep, are but the wild workings of the imagination. David Hume continues on this theme, arguing that nightmares are nothing more than the confused emotions of a mind disturbed by a multitude of unconnected ideas. Even though we might not find this convincing today, it's a step in the right direction that these thinkers were recognizing that dreams were not supernatural visitation, but instead the result of the inner workings of the mind. All of this brings us back to Freud and Ernst Lanzer, the Rat Man. Freud, like the Enlightenment thinkers, was able to recognize that nightmares were not supernatural visitations, but, unlike these Enlightenment thinkers, that they weren't just meaningless. He would go on to try and interpret the inner psychological root of various nightmares that had plagued his clients, including a girl who was haunted by visions of her house being burned down, and a young man who dreamed of being stalked by packs of wolves. In typical Freudian fashion, he considered most of the root causes to be the result of sexual repression and an inability to face the power dynamics that exist within family relationships. In the case of the Rat Man, Freud believed that it came from a fear of abandonment, of shame from his romantic relationships, and a deep-rooted fear of castration. The Rat Man himself, Ernst Lanzer, never properly recovered from his obsession with rats, although Freud writes that he was able to manage his symptoms better after his treatment. Carl Jung would then go on to later develop Freud's ideas on nightmares, focusing less on the premise that they came from repressed desires or fears about sexual development, and that they were instead more to do with warnings sent from the unconscious mind to conscious thoughts. To quote Jung directly, nightmares are not only expressions of fear, but often contain guidance for what the conscious mind must address or confront in order to grow. All of these things bring us to the modern day world, which begs the question, what are nightmares? And one of the most common explanations are simply that nightmares are the result of external stress, anxiety, or trauma. The psychologist Dr. Barry Krakow writes that nightmares are often a reflection of the unresolved issues in a person's waking life, an attempt by the brain to deal with emotional distress and anxiety. Evolutionary psychologists have a slightly different take, and in the words of Moffat, nightmares have evolved as a way for humans to practice escaping dangers and threats, helping them prepare for the real-world challenges of survival. So, what would a modern-day psychologist make of the Rat Man and his disturbing dreams? Well, obviously I'm not a psychologist, but from the research I was able to do, it looks like he would probably be diagnosed with OCD. Obsessive and repetitive thoughts about his gruesome death, and a series of rituals and behaviours that he came up with to try and suppress these thoughts and, in his own mind, lower the chances of this grim fate ever happening. And given that he had OCD, or may have had OCD, this waking obsession was predictably always going to bleed into his sleeping thoughts. So, that's the history of nightmares. First, they were thought to be meaningful messages from the gods, then meaningless messages made up by the mind, and finally, meaningful messages fashioned by a mired and tormented mind. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving us a subscribe, and if you want to support the channel, we're on Patreon, so you can join there. We have a fun little community. We do fun stuff. Not sure what the benefits are yet. We're still just trying things out. Bye-bye.